Vaishtavair Vedai Sango Pakramo Panishadair Gayanti Jang Samaga Dhyana-avasthita tadgatena manasa Pashyanti jang yoginaha Yasyantang na vidussura suragana Devaya tasmai namo namah Om. Our salutations to that Supreme Being who is one without a second, whom the sages call by various names. Our salutations to him, whose glory has been sung through the rapturous hymns of the scriptures of the world, but whose limitless and infinite glory none can comprehend. But again, whom the sages and devotees realize within their hearts in their deepest contemplation, him we salute again and again. May he shine in our hearts, manifest therein all his glory, and dispel all darkness and ignorance. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. I'm going to speak to you this morning on the psychology of yoga. At the outset, I must point out the two different approaches to psychology, the Eastern and the Western. In the West, psychology is defined as science of the nature, function, and phenomena of the human soul or mind. Now here we get the main point of difference. Mind is identified with the soul or mind. Whereas in Eastern psychology, soul or Atman is something different and distinct from the mind. As we read in the Bhagavad Gita, behind the mind and distinct from it is that which is the principle of consciousness in all beings and the source of life in all. You see, there is a principle of consciousness, or that I am conscious, you are conscious, and there is that consciousness everywhere in the universe, in fact. That consciousness is of the spirit, of the Atman. In the West, mind, the inherent nature of the mind is said to be consciousness, and which is not the fact. Mind, its inherent nature is not consciousness. How? Because the mind becomes unconscious. It loses consciousness. For instance, every night when you go to sleep, and if you have deep sleep, you are unconscious. And yet again, there is a continuity of consciousness persisting in each one of us. And that is the consciousness of the Atman, of the spirit. So mind and spirit, mind and Atman we call the self, are two distinct substances. Now again, according to the West, man is a physical and mental being. And so, always there has been the attempt to gather intellectual or mental information and to develop mentally and physically. Whereas in the East, man is regarded as a spiritual being. Now, when I say West and East, please understand that by the West I do not include Christ. I do not include the teachings of Christ. Because, please remember that Christ was, after all, an Oriental. So when I talk of the East, in the East I include Christ and his teachings. Now, in the East, man is considered a spiritual being. In other words, fundamentally he is spirit. And he has a mind and he has a body. Now therefore, the ideal in the East is to know the Atman, to know the self. And if you know the self, you know God. Now, according to the West again, there are three areas of the mind: conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. According to the East, there is the fourth. Besides these three states of consciousness, there is the fourth, we call Turiya, the fourth, transcendent. And within these three states of consciousness, the thing, the reality, the thing in itself, as Kant said, cannot be known. You see, none of us within these three states of consciousness can be really wise, or what we call wisdom, the knowledge of the reality cannot be had within these three states of consciousness. One great German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, he pointed out definitely how the thing in itself remains unknown and unknowable. Why? Because in all our knowledge, there is the distinction between the subject and the object. I know this. Now, the object, what it is in itself, remains unknown. And this I, who is the knower, also remains unknown. And the great seer philosopher of India, Shankara, he pointed out the same thing. As long as there is the least demarcation between the knower and the object of knowledge, the reality does not become known. But here the great seer philosopher points out, and which has been pointed out but by all the great teachers of the world, that these three knots of knowledge, technically called the knower, the object of knowledge, and the process of knowledge, these are called the three knots of knowledge, can be untied, and there is the unified consciousness. And in that unified consciousness, the self or God becomes revealed. All the mystics, the great mystics of the world, whether they are Christians or Sufis or Hindus or Jews, those mystics have transcended these three states of consciousness, the waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep. And by transcending these, they have attained to the knowledge of the reality. Now again, let us come to the objectives. The objectives of both the Eastern and the Western psychologists apparently seem to be the same. To quote, how the Western psychologists point out how by controlling the subconscious and unconscious, knowing their true nature, we can in our waking state become normal, integrated, and function with greater harmony and happiness for ourselves and others. Now, the point is how by controlling the subconscious and unconscious. In other words, the objective is to attain greater harmony and happiness for ourselves and others, and which can be achieved by the control of the subconscious and the unconscious. Now, with regard to this objective and the method, both psychologists, the Western and the Eastern, agree. But the point is, this objective, this ideal, as the modern psychologists do admit, is not achieved. There is no such thing in our consciousness, in our experience ordinarily, as unalloyed happiness. As one great psychologist of the present day pointed out, unalloyed joy is an unknown or forgotten sensation. It's unknown. And yet again, we find this objective is attained by the holy men, by the mystics. They live immersed in bliss. Yes, again we find that these great holy men, they also are sad. They feel suffering. They suffer. But you know, their sadness, their suffering is seeing the suffering of the world. But there is an inner joy in them. Because the Atman, the self, its very nature is Ananda, joy. Now, before I come to that again, let me point out that the subconscious and the unconscious need to be controlled. This is also the method as given, as told by the psychologists of the West. But their method, unfortunately, does not work. For instance, they try to bring out your subconscious mind, your unconscious mind. And what happens? As you go and become analyzed from day to day, you find yourself thinking about yourself, about your ego, all the time. You can't talk anything else. You can't get interested in anything else but your own problems. In other words, the way these subconscious ideas and thoughts are brought out, they create a greater impression. Now let us try to understand what is this subconscious mind or unconscious mind. There are not three minds, but they are the areas of the mind. I am thinking or I am acting. My action and my thoughts are consciously thought and done. Now, that conscious thought, that conscious action has created an impression in my mind. And the sum total of those impressions form my character. Whatever you are, and whatever tendencies you have, they have been created by yourself with your conscious mind and conscious thoughts. Now, the moment this subconscious mind comes to you, and willfully, if you bring it out in memory, it creates again another impression. And you remain within that vicious circle. Now I'll point out later how Indian psychology also brings out the subconscious mind, but it oozes out. Now to come to the point. It's a fact of experience, that the great mystics of the world, a Christ, a Buddha, a Krishna, a Ramakrishna, and also the mystics, they have experienced the unalloyed joy. You know, Buddha, for instance, began his whole spiritual philosophy based upon the fact of suffering. And he pointed out how that suffering can be overcome. And the complete cessation of suffering. You see, true that we can alleviate the suffering, what we suffer from today, perhaps that can be alleviated. But complete cessation is not possible except by these great ones who transcend the states of consciousness. Now again, this unalloyed joy is the very nature of the Atman, is the very nature of the self. And it is not that you have to achieve something that you do not have. Here is the most interesting point that is in every religion. That the freedom, the joy, the salvation, the liberation, the knowledge, the infinite love that we are seeking is something ingrained in us. That is the very nature of the Atman, very nature of the self. So it is not that you have to acquire something from outside, but it is already there. Only covered. For instance, Jesus points out, the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There is the light shining. But because of the darkness, we do not realize, we do not comprehend that light. The divinity or God is dwelling within each one of us. He is our very self. But we do not know. We are not conscious of it. Because there is a covering of ignorance. Now, you see, this ignorance is universal. Now the question arises, how could this ignorance come? In other words, there is that question, how did man fall into this state of ignorance? In the Bible, for instance, you have this idea that God made man in his own image. There is that perfection already in man. But there is the fall of Adam. Now, of course, through mythology or through philosophy, they try to explain, or rather explain away, how this fall of man happened. But Vedanta points out, very frankly, that this is something that is impossible, has happened, we do not know how. We cannot explain. Philosophically, through analysis, it says that light and darkness are opposed to each other. And you cannot confuse light with darkness or darkness with light. Similarly, the I, the subject, and the object are so opposed to each other that it is impossible that you'd identify the object as subject or subject as object. But this impossible something has happened. And it has happened in the consciousness of every being, universal ignorance. For example, if you analyze, you know that you are not the body. This is known to everybody. You are not the body. But every moment you are identifying yourself with the body. I weigh so much. I am so many years old. Now again, the fact is that mind is something that is objective. You are not the mind. And yet you are identifying yourself with the moods of the mind. How this has happened, we do not know, though it is something impossible to happen, but it has happened. And so they say it is inexplainable. Now again they try to explain this. As long as we are in ignorance, we cannot answer. But when we know, when we have the wisdom, then why this ignorance came, that question does not arise, because there is no ignorance there. Now, this ignorance again has two functions. One is, it has covered the truth, the reality that is within us, and has created something that has no existence in reality. And what is that? The sense of ego. First, the Atman, the spirit, that I am the spirit, I have forgotten. And then I consider myself as an individual being. A sense of ego has arisen in me. What is the definition of this ego? The Atman identifying with something that it is not. Just as I explained to you, that I am not the body, and yet I identify myself with the body. I am not the mind, yet I identify myself with the mind. So this is the sense of ego. Now, what are the causes of suffering and the obstacles to the attainment of the goal? First, there is the ignorance. Then has come this sense of ego. With this sense of ego, we feel a lack. You know, there's a God urge in us, because that God is within each one of us. That divinity is within each one of us. And there is that urge to unfold that. All the struggles, all the experiences that you go through, the motive behind is God urge. If only the psychologists of the West would understand this urge. It's nothing else. For instance, sex. What is behind that? You want joy, pleasure, happiness. Or you want to get something, or another something you want to achieve. What for? To attain freedom, to attain happiness. And you are not satisfied with finite, limited pleasure, with limited happiness or limited freedom. You want unlimited freedom. You want unalloyed joy. And that is because there is that divinity within you, and that divinity is trying to unfold itself. Only trying to unfold itself by means which lead you to greater bondages. But the urge is there. Swami Vivekananda pointed out this way, that you, the almighty cause of the universe, are trying to unfold yourself in little mud puddles. But after a time, you realize that is not possible. So you turn back from where you began. And that is the beginning of religion. I shall make that clear. Now, as there is that urge, so what are we trying to do? We become attached to some objects or to some persons, and we think by such attachment there will be fulfillment in us. Then again, there's an aversion to things and persons and objects that give us suffering or pain. And then there is the clinging to this surface life. You see, these are the 5 causes of suffering, and they are the obstacles that we have to remove. First, ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, clinging to the surface life. This clinging to this surface life is something that is instinctive in every one of us. For instance, this consciousness, this surface consciousness that we have, we do not want to lose that. The mystics point out that there comes a moment in his life when he becomes fearful to become absorbed in the consciousness of God. Those of you who ever have meditated and have been fortunate enough to get absorption will find that you are about to lose this consciousness, and as such you become afraid and you wake up. And that is because of that clinging to that life that is instinctive in every one of us. But of course the mystic overcomes that, because that consciousness that we attain through absorption is a wider consciousness. That is the difference. To give an illustration, the lower animals, for instance, the dog or the cat or the cow or the horse and human beings, we are all living in the same world. But our experience of this world again are so different. For instance, you and I can appreciate the beauty of a rose, but a dog or a cat cannot appreciate that. In order that they can appreciate, they have to have wider consciousness. But suppose you tell the cat or the dog, now look here, I shall give you human consciousness. You'd object to that. He will say, I'm quite happy as I am. And the same way with us. You see, for instance, if any great soul, and it is possible that these great souls can do that, a Christ or a Ramakrishna, by touch, by their mere wish, can lift you into that higher consciousness. But you will object. But of course, you can't continue to object longer, because you begin to see the beauty and greatness of that. If you read the life of Ramakrishna and his association with Vivekananda, when he was a young boy, as he came to Ramakrishna, you see, he asked him, have you seen God? And he says, yes, I have seen. Can you show me? Yes. And as he gave him the touch, and he was about to lose this consciousness, he said, oh, what are you doing to me? I have my parents. And so Ramakrishna said, you too. Because this clinging to life is something that is universal. And referring to this, because as I said, very few of us desire to broaden our consciousness, to transcend this consciousness. And that is why Jesus said, he who loves this life shall lose it. Because we are subject to death and rebirth. But when we transcend this instinct in us, then we attain the eternal life, the immortal life. Now, the question, or the most practical part of it, is how to overcome these obstacles. That is the point. And the principle that is given by the great psychologist of India, Patanjali, he says that if we can control the waves of the mind, then immediately we realize our true self and we realize God. The simple principle, if we can somehow control the waves of the mind. Now, what are the waves of the mind? All the time the mind is lashed into waves. So many thoughts, distractions, desires, passions, all these are arising in the mind all the time. And somehow, if all those can be controlled and the mind can be made calm, then the truth becomes attained. Now, of course, you see, people again misunderstand this principle. You see, a little learning is dangerous. And so they study a little of the Eastern philosophy and psychology, and then they say, they teach meditation, for instance, by saying, eliminate all thoughts from your mind. Make your mind thoughtless, contentless. But is that possible? The point is this, that this calmness of the mind that we have to achieve is not a calmness on the surface again. You have to dig out your subconscious and unconscious mind and be completely overhauled. Saint Paul said, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This renewing of the mind. You see what the modern psychologists are pointing out, that we have to control the conscious, subconscious and unconscious mind, because our conscious mind is controlled by our subconscious mind, and which we have ourselves created. Now, for instance, you try to concentrate upon something. Immediately you find so many distractions arising. And it is because those distractions are coming from the subconscious mind. And so it is a complete overhauling, transforming the mind completely. Referring to that, Jesus had pointed out in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So this calmness is that purity of the heart. Now, how to achieve that? If we consider that there are these waves in our mind, which we have created, of course, these waves are innumerable. Innumerable waves. Because we have so many different kinds of thoughts, desires, actions. You see, if you just go to analyze, there are innumerable waves are there in our subconscious mind, and in our conscious mind they arise. Now again, these innumerable waves can be classified under two heads. Those waves of thought are those tendencies that we have created. Some of them are bad, and we have also created some good tendencies that are good. You see, each individual you will find is a mixture of both good and bad. Now the principle is to control all waves of thought, no matter whether they are good or bad. But before we can achieve that, we have to overcome the evil by good. So there are two kinds of vrittis or waves. Those that are bad, that lead us to greater bondage, and those that are good, that lead us to greater freedom. You see, you can't live, you can't exist without waves of thought or without action. It's not possible. Now therefore, we have to strengthen ourselves, strengthen our mind by creating good tendencies, pure character. We have to form a character which should be pure and good. Now, how to do that? You see, when Sri Krishna, for instance, taught Arjuna, the disciple, and told him to gain that control over the mind, the disciple's complaint was that the wind is not wilder. Mind is so wild. He says, if you ask me to control the weather, perhaps I'll be able to do that. But to control the mind seems impossible. Then the great teacher Sri Krishna says, the mind is restless, no doubt, and hard to subdue, but it can be brought under control by constant practice and by the exercise of dispassion. You see, the character that we have formed, how have we formed that character? By our habits, by practice. And now we have become subject. We have become slaves to our subconscious mind, become slave to our tendencies. We have to create new tendencies. What is character? Bundle of habits. One bundle of habits can be replaced by another bundle of habits. So, the yoga psychology points out that we must create some new habits in life. And what are those? There are certain ethical principles in life upon which we must base our spiritual life. You know, there's a saying, that people, they are praying and praying and praying and they meditating and meditating and meditating and nothing happens. And nothing happens. In other words, spiritual life, you cannot grow in spiritual life until you have the basis, the foundation strong. And that foundation is ethical life. There's a saying that a farmer was cultivating his land, and he worked all night and brought water into his land. And then in the morning when the daylight came, he looked at the land and it was still dry. You see what happened? There were rat holes. And all that water just gone. So this great psychologist points out that there are certain ethical principles which we have to observe. What are those? First is, we must not hurt anybody in word, thought, or deed. This is a principle in life that we must observe. Must not hurt anybody in word, thought, or deed. Then truthfulness. And this truthfulness again in thought, word, and deed. And furthermore, we have to observe that we may not hurt others by our truthfulness. You see, that also we have to observe. To not hurt anybody is the most fundamental thing. I may not be the cause, may I never be the cause of hurting anybody. You see, we must be established in that. By words, you see, perhaps you are truthful, saying something truthful about somebody else. But you see, if that truth hurts somebody, that is not right. There again we have to be careful. So, tell the truth. This is what my master many times repeated to me. Speak the truth, but not a harsh truth. Then, non-stealing. Now this is very interesting. Because I don't believe that any of us, except thieves, yes, or those who are generally, I don't think we do steal anything. But according to this yoga psychologist, we are all thieves. You see, he points out, you have a bank account, or you have a house, and you feel that it is yours. That's thieving, he says. You see, everything belongs to nature or belongs to God. Now, that doesn't mean that you must not have any bank account or you must not own any home. It's not that. But just consider yourself a trustee. Do not be possessed by your wealth. You see, that is the principle. And that is the principle of non-stealing, the practice of non-stealing. In other words, you must learn to be non-attached to things and objects of the world. Nothing is your own. Now that reminds me, I read some book some time ago, the life of a Hollywood director. And he was told, when he was told that, you are amassing this wealth, but when you die, you can't take them with you. And he said, well, then I won't die. See? And so, be non-attached. There's a saying, have possessions, but not be possessed by your possessions. Then again, chastity in word, thought, and deed. Now, of course, you see, those, for instance, in married life also, there is chastity, faithfulness. And then it is not, you see, married life is a life to learn to control. That is the objective. To overcome ultimately the idea of sex. Then again, not to covet anybody's wealth. Not to be greedy. These are some of the principles that we must practice, follow. And then we must create certain regular habits. Those habits are, first, cleanliness, physical and mental. Physical, of course, is very easy, by bath, by bathing. But mental, what is mental cleanliness? You have to achieve, you have to clean your mind as it were every day. A regular practice. And this is what the psychologist points out. Feel the presence of God within you and feel that you are bathed in that presence and you are washed. This idea that I am weak, I am a sinner, is not good. What you think, you become. And just have this faith that if you chant the name of the Lord, you become pure, no matter what you did in the past. And every day, cleanse your mind that way, feeling the presence of God, and repeat, I am pure, I am pure, I am pure. Then, contentment with your environment and conditions of life. Because you may think that the ideal condition is not this, I must have ideal condition in this other way. And you find yourself in greater difficulty. So if the conditions are not ideal, but if you are contented and if you try become a spiritual aspirant, things clear up, conditions become favorable. And then regular study, that's a practice. Regular study of scriptures that would evoke in you devotion to God. And then also study means repeating the name of God, what we call japam. And then every day offer all your actions, the results of all your actions to God. You see, as you go to meditate in the evening, think of all what you have done at daytime and offer the fruits of your action to God. It's a regular habit. And then, of course, a regular habit of concentration, prayer, meditation. You see, this is overhauling the mind. And then there comes a time, as you practice, the mind, the tendency of the mind has become such that it loves to think of God constantly. There's a current flowing within you. You see, you have controlled without any attempt. You have controlled your subconscious and unconscious mind. And then when there is that constant recollectedness, then there arises illumined knowledge of the self or God. And you attain that perfection in Godhead. You become a blessing to yourself, and you become a blessing to all mankind. Om Hari Om. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya. Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya. Mritturma Amritangamaya. Abir Maidhi. Rudrajate Dakshinang Mukham. Te Namang Pahi Nityam. Oh, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from death to immortality. Lead us from darkness to light. Light us through and through, and guide us evermore with thy loving presence. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace.